Yes, thank you everyone for joining us, for taking time out of your day to listen to our stories, to engage in this workshop, and pursue diversity, equity, and division, and inclusion within the engineering education community. As you all know, the title of our presentation is "Do You See Me? Hypervisible Invisibility, # Engineering While Black," and it's really a play on this concept presented in the paper by Maureen Reddy in 1998, entitled Invisibility, Hypervisibility, the Paradox of Normative Whiteness, where she talks about how whiteness is invisible to those who are white, but hypervisible to those who are not. And so we flip that and saying, like, if whiteness is the norm, then blackness becomes hypervisible as an abnorm or antithesis to that norm. But our values, our voices are invisible and undervalued. And so that's the frame of this conversation and workshop. Can you get the next slide for me, Chanel? And so we see the failure of engineering field to recruit, retain, and successfully prepare Black students as a crisis. And as Black scholars, we each leverage, each as scholars approach this problem in different ways. But we want to, this was developed long before our current climate. And I think it just reinforces and reiterates what we're saying here, that considering our perspective as those disenfranchised and marginalized can provide a way forward for us to better serve or better actualize inclusion and diversity within our community. Next slide. Our objectives for today is, one, to provide insights on valuing counter storytelling and the methodological practices associated with it. We'll say more about that. Provide a space for modeling, listening, and reflective practice. And that's really the emphasis of today's session, is to allow you all as attendees to listen and be reflexive, and then ultimately to share our stories of studying and doing engineering as Black people.
So we wanted to provide you with more context about the methodology behind counter storytelling. The first methodology that people can do counter storytelling with is autoethnography, which is just a study of one's personal self as it pertains to research to provide a greater understanding of self within a given context. And then the next methodology is narrative inquiry, which is the process of gathering information to be able to provide a story to tell. Here are a few different data collection methods. For our particular talk today, we will be using oral stories to tell our stories. And for data analysis, we won't really go too much in depth with data analysis methods, but here are a few for counter narratives. What we'll be doing today is using a journal for you all to reflect on our stories.
So before we get into the reflection and the reflexiveness that we would like to see today, we did want to mention two things. One, both reflection and reflexivity are more than research practices. We'll get into the difference between those two things in a second. But these are things you can do, obviously, to deepen the impact of your research work, but also things that you can do to deepen your appreciation of your life in general. Reflexivity is all about kind of thinking about what's happening around you and your relationship to those things. We will also say that qualitative research and the methodologies associated with it, including reflexivity, they are their own fields of study. We are not experts in these things. Many of us have engaged in some of this stuff as a part of our work, and some of us have just had to understand it in order to give language to our work. So we are just kind of presenting one pathway. We encourage you to continue to explore any of these topics if they're interesting to you. There are a lot of experts in these fields, many of them who are our mentors that we reached out to literally every step of the way to make sure we were describing things in ways that made sense and matched up with stuff that you can get more information about somewhere else. Okay, so if we think about reflexivity in terms of qualitative research, it is a reflection on your relationship with the data. So this is different from reflection. Reflection is, how does it make you feel? What does it make you think? Reflexivity is, what parts of me are connected to this? What parts of me are interacting with this? And how does that affect what I can hear? A part of reflexivity is this concept called bracketing, which is its own, you can do some research on that. But bracketing kind of requires you to unpack who are you within this story, right? So before you can get to a place of understanding what parts of your identity are impacted by the situation, you have to have some type of cognition of what your identity is. So bracketing, we're not going to get into too deeply, but questions that can kind of point you to where you might be, those first reflection questions. So how do I feel? Usually how you feel will tell you a little bit about who you are and what identities are kind of being affected. Then you can get deeper and start getting to more reflexive practices where you can think about what is my relationship to this experience, and then you could get even deeper and start thinking about like power dynamics and those kind of things. We're not going to get into all that today, but we did want to mention that who you are matters and how you listen matter, okay? So within qualitative research and within life in general, you are not completely unbiased. You are not just an objective researcher. You're the instrument through which this research is happening. All of these conversations are usually reflected in what's called a positionality statement. Positionality refers to what you know, and reflexivity is about what you do with that knowledge. There's a paper that myself and some colleagues have under review right now in JEE about positionality, and a little bit about reflexivity as well. So this is a space you can go if you want to learn more about that. And now Deli is going to talk about how we're going to be using these concepts in today's workshop.
Great. So what we wanted to do is provide a way for attendees to learn to listen, to practice listening. And so the goal of today's workshop is we will share the stories. We represent some of the marginalized voices, and we invite you to practice reflexivity as Chanel talked about. We want you to begin to think about what are the implications for your current and future research practices, and that we hope that by the end of this, you will have engaged in an active listening and with respect to understanding the variety and the richness of narratives. The main idea is that we don't represent all Black scholars. We don't represent all Black experiences. And so we want to push back against that by presenting a case, a subset, and that as you listen, you'll see distinctions in our stories. And then you're going to reflect here. So we've created a notebook. And so this is the URL. I think can we copy and paste that into the chat? And what you'll do is you're going to go to that site, and in that site you will share your reflections. We have guiding questions on how you will bracket. So bracketing what parts of your identity or experiences are connected or disconnected from what you heard. Then you'll practice listening. What is it that you're hearing? So you'll start writing some summary statements as you're documenting your listening. And then taking ownership, you start to think with what the reflection I've done, kind of bracketing and the listening, what part of my research can be affected by what I've listened to in these stories. And then finally, we'll focus on actions. Are there concerns that arose, questions you have, and then explicitly next steps. And so everyone, there are 4 storytellers. I call us scholar storytellers. You can go through each of the table. We have about 2 tables per. You do not have to disclose your name, but if you feel comfortable, you can write your name and your affiliation, and you can also navigate through the stories on the left-hand side using the table of contents to quickly get to the stories. If you make a mistake and copy and write someone like Chanel's story in James's column, copy and paste it, move it down. And we understand there'll be a lot of people in there. It'll be pretty active. It'll be growing and moving, but we hope that this will be a way for you to engage with us through this workshop. Thanks, Chanel.
And so to begin, I want to, highlight some of the questions that we asked ourselves that we will be reflecting on. One, what is our role within the engineering education community? Secondly, what was our educational trajectory into our current roles? And then thirdly, what factors contributed to our epistemological and ontological engagement with the engineering education community? But in addition to that, one thing I thought about is just, I didn't speak to like how we connected. So as you all can see, we are Black, but we're all originally from either Detroit or the Metro Detroit area. We all are currently in or have gone through Purdue's engineering education PhD program. And so that was a connection point for us. And so I think it's very important to highlight, like, even though there's some similarities, there's so much diversity within people's experience, whatever it may be. And with that, I'll begin my own story. So being a native Detroiter, oh, sorry, one more thing.
1 second. So we're not going to be sharing our screen during this. The point of this is for you guys to listen to our stories. So we do encourage you to highlight or spotlight whichever story is being told, so that that's the only thing on your screen, or at least on your Zoom screen, and then you can go back and forth between this and your notebook if you would like. But we do kind of encourage you to focus in on whoever's sharing.
Sorry, one more interruption. If everyone could also mute yourselves so that if like James is speaking and you start ruffling, we don't hear that. Thanks.
Donovan, you got something to say? No, just kidding. No, so yeah, so with my story being a Black male from Detroit, I went to public schools in Detroit, elementary and middle school, and then I went to my high school was a private Catholic Jesuit school that was all males, and the demographic is predominantly white males from wealthy backgrounds. And so I bring it up to say, like, that was the experiences I had there in shaping my identity, not even necessarily as a scholar, but as a person, just racialized dynamics I experienced led me to pursue higher education, my bachelor's at a Black college. I went to Tuskegee University. And at the time, I didn't really know. I knew I wanted to go to college because that's what my mom and family members encouraged me to do, but I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to study. And so having interest in math and science, I was encouraged to study engineering. And I literally had to Google like what that was and also what disciplines were within that to select my curriculum trajectory, or whatever the case may be. And it was interesting because now reflecting back, I hear a lot of people encourage people to study engineering when you do well in math and science. But the other side of that is usually like hands-on problem solving. That was not necessarily my thing. I didn't take things apart and put them back together. I like problem solving, but I'm not too hands-on in that regard. And so I had some experience with the Detroit area pre-college engineering program, DAPSEP, that I think is another connection point with all of us on this call. So I had minor engagement and exposure to engineering, but it's not something I fully conceptualized. And so when I was studying it, I enjoyed the classes, I enjoyed college, but it was when I was getting to my latter years that I was trying to figure out, am I going to pursue engineering or am I going to do something else? And I kind of felt as if I wanted to do something else. Like I didn't fit within what I considered to be the profile of an engineer. But coming from my background and family members, that I was in college, engineers make a lot of money. I was heavily encouraged to continue pursuing that. And so trying to wrestle with this tension, I was talking with one of my professors. And beyond even getting this bachelor's degree, she said, you're going to get a PhD someday. And I was like, wow, like I appreciate your confidence, but I don't know what that is. And I'm pretty sure I don't have any interest. But time progressed and I came back to her like, okay, is there an intermediate step? Like, what is this? You know, school is not that annoying to me. It's okay. I enjoy socializing and being in the space. And so she helped me, her and another professor helped me get into, prepare my package for a master's program. And I figured if I specified my study and honed in on something in particular, and that would give me a better idea. And so I wanted to pursue my master's degree at Michigan State, while also trying to come close to home. Because as I left Detroit, I knew I always wanted to return to Detroit and leverage whatever talents, gifts, energy towards supporting people in Detroit. And so when I got there, started taking class, and I was like, all right, halfway into my first year, I decided this is not the trajectory. Like, I am not going to be an engineer. This is not the role. But trying to figure what to do next was difficult, again, because engineering is seen as a context of upward mobility for Black, lower income or middle income folks. And so I learned about Purdue's engineering program, just talking to different people. And what I saw was the opportunity to merge what I identify as a passion of youth development, specifically urban Black youth development, with this 6 or 7 years of training in engineering. And I saw an opportunity to merge those, focusing on pre-college engineering education. And so I pursued that, and I ended up at Purdue. And my dissertation was teaching engineering to Black boys as a Black man. It was a critical autoethnography. And what that allowed me to do was to tell my story of, as I'm doing now, like that trajectory and that research in a systematic way, but also talk about how that informed the way that I taught engineering, the way that I perceived engineering. And how I see my role currently is not necessarily advancing engineering and trying to recruit people into engineering, but more so trying to show how engineering is not inclusive. Right? Specifically as it relates to race. How does engineering culture and engineering pedagogy specifically endorse or sustain white supremacy and white normativity and racism, specifically anti-Blackness. And so in my current role, I'm at Wayne State. I'm an assistant professor in urban STEM education. And I work with pre-service teachers, people, folks who want to be science teachers and math teachers, as well as engineering. And what I try to help them do is to see, like, here's the content. This is what we understand science is in a public, prominent, or dominant discourse. How does that include or exclude folks like myself who are from Detroit, who are not seen as science natives, like the trees and the hair, our hair, those aren't seen as scientific processes, even though they involve natural science, right? Physics, biology, and all those things. How do we exclude them? But also, how can we include those perspectives and see students as through their cultural and racial lens as having knowledge that can reinforce the content? So not censoring the content, but censoring the human, and trying to help them gain some content that can enrich their experience as individuals, but also as a society. And so for me, it was always that desire of centering myself in my Blackness, centering myself in my Detroit community that framed the value of engineering to me. And throughout that trajectory, I didn't see a connection point until I was like, okay, engineering in pre-college space is much broader, how we conceive it and what we can do with it. So I don't have to teach engineering to entice and try to recruit Black boys, but rather I can teach it as a problem-solving methodology that can help them navigate whatever way they have to do, in race in particular. And that was the value that I saw. And that's what I try to do now and work with pre-service teachers. Like, science is helpful, math is helpful, but how can we use it to help students better navigate the context around them? And also just see the ways that these disciplines, by being communicated and conceived as objective and not allowing space for subjectivities, how that has specifically excluded folks like Black people in urban contexts. So how do we not see that as something else to break that culture and counteract that culture, but rather see it as essential and core to true knowledge, right? To truly understand science means that we understand in all its forms and ways. To truly understand mathematics, meaning mathematical thinking presents itself in various ways in various cultures. To understand that engineering advantages and disadvantages. Right? When we talk about environmental racism and the ways that urban communities have these engineering industries that put them at greater rates for pollution and health disparities and problems. How do we look at science through the lens of our current coronavirus, right? And how that disproportionately was fatal for Black people. What's the science lesson in that? And how do we avoid those type of dynamics? So that's how I show up in the space currently. And that's the lens I use to do my work.
Perfect timing, James.
I'll pass the mic.
So how much time did we say? Is it 7 minutes or 10?
7.5 is what I did.
All right, I'm gonna do the same thing. So there are a lot of connection points between all of these stories. Like James said, I am also from Detroit. I don't want to get too in depth in like my early years, but I will say a lot of my success and ambition had to do with the way my education was cared for. Out the womb, I had two grandmothers who had very clear ideas as to what my educational options and outcomes could be. And I had a mother who was very, very invested in making sure that every hiccup that she might have experienced in her educational process, I didn't experience. And then I also had a father who was like the third generation of entrepreneurs in his family and had a very strong sense of what I needed to know in order to take care of myself. I excelled in school, but I didn't notice because I was kept very busy. I was very involved in church, but also had a constant stream of extracurricular activities. With me being raised where I was raised, in hindsight, I realized there was a lot of stuff happening on my block, and my parents were trying to make sure that I had other things to do. But experiencing it, it was just a constant flow of things. You know, most things I like, but my mom was pretty attuned to the things that I didn't like. And I want to say that I finally articulated some type of interest in engineering because I knew what I didn't want to do. So my options were DAPSAP, which is the program that James alluded to, Detroit Area Pre-College Program. They had like weekend things. My other options were this program called Junior Great Books, which was based out of the library here in Detroit. And essentially you got like a book and you met with people every week to read stories and talk about books. And I was just like, I want to do engineering. I don't want to read on the weekend. Like, that's not fun. I want to make stuff on the weekend. So from having articulated that interest, I ended up in a lot of engineering summer programs. The most influential of which was at the University of Michigan. And I just dropped the link to the Center for Engineering, Diversity, and Outreach, which I think used to be called something else when I was there. But they have a pretty wide variety of summer programs for high school students, just like Purdue does. I did some work with them eventually as well. But in those programs, I was able to identify what type of engineering I wanted to do, even before I had submitted any application. So, you know, there's a little bit of difference between the James' story and mine, I guess, because I knew what type of engineering I wanted to do junior year of high school. However, similar to James' story, that conception of engineering wasn't necessarily tied to what I really wanted to do in my environment. So though I would go to these summer programs and these weekend programs for engineering, during the actual school day, I was doing entrepreneurship. So in high school, I started a school store that still kind of exists to this day. But when I say started, I mean we wrote letters to get funding, designed the inventory, picked the POS system, like manage the staff. So during the week, I knew entrepreneurship and business what mattered to me a lot because of the impact that I could see both on my peers, but also on my community. And like I said, my dad was an entrepreneur, so I would ride around with him and kind of understanding how he provides what he provides. So it wasn't really until I got to college that I started understanding what the life of an engineer would be and how that was different from the entrepreneurship and the kind of community service piece that I had been used to doing. I want to say my first mentor was through the National Society of Black Engineers. Once I got to University of Michigan, dropped a link to them. She was the first person to kind of give me an insight into the life of an engineer. And I started getting internships and doing a lot of stereotypical, you know, engineering undergrad student things. But I also was very involved in my community. So I took jobs that allowed me to go back to the city and talk about how to get scholarships. We also did the Being Black at University of Michigan movement. I think that was my junior year, where we started to surface issues of racism on campus. I was involved in Bible studies and those kind of things. So by the time I got to my second senior year, because I did a fifth year because I wanted to, and I had scholarship money that would let me do that. By the time I got to my fifth year, which we call the Victory Lap, I was very, very critical of how I wanted to spend my time. I had 2 corporate internships, and the one that I liked the most, I still wasn't satisfied. My boss, who is still kind of a mentor to me now, he asked me what I was passionate about because he noticed that I was completing projects at different rates. And I was very clear about the fact that the only thing that determined what I finished was the people associated with it, and how intricately I knew what they needed, and what impact I felt like that thing could have. So once I identified that people was what I cared about, once I identified that, like, in my free time I was mentoring and teaching, I decided that I was really concerned about the way engineering was taught, and the way I experienced it, because it was very traumatic. And I had kind of decided that I would start my own school for engineering education. And then I found out that there was one, because I took a class with Shauna Daly during that Victory Lap. And that was the first class I took where I felt like the professor understood the experience of the student and that the class was flexible enough for me to bring what I actually cared about into the curriculum. So at that point, I decided I would pursue a PhD in engineering education, but I still had a lot of kind of industrial engineering manufacturing experience. So I wanted to do a little bit of training. So I decided I would do a master's in engineering management before I did the PhD in engineering education. But when I went down to the master's in engineering education, when I went down to the master's in engineering management, my scholarship switched it up on me the Friday before classes started and said that they would not cover engineering management. And because I had spent all of my internship money to move down there, I didn't really have no options. So what I did was I switched to a program they would cover. That was something I knew I cared about. I think I switched to environmental engineering. I did that for 2 months and then realized what graduate level thinking was like. And was like, I could do this, but not for something that I just changed to. So I decided to drop out of that program. But before I left, I did my application for the engineering education program because I knew that that was the level of graduate study I wanted to do. So I moved back to Detroit for 8 months, very much against the advice of my mother. Even my grandmother was like, what's going on? Like, you don't quit stuff. And I was like, no, I'm not about to just get a degree I don't need. So in that time, between the PhD program, I was living in Detroit for 8 months and I had time to learn teaching. I took a job with a nonprofit and my time is up, but I'm almost done. I'm sorry, y'all. You see, I tried, James. I did turn the timer on this time. But as I was teaching, I realized that my concern was for informal spaces. I started doing art and poetry. I started teaching in museums and in informal spaces. And kind of similar to James, it was important to me that engineering was taught for the sake of the problems it can solve, for the sake of the type of systems thinking that it allows that really changes the emotional experience of a lot of the oppression of the communities I care about. So the work I do now is all tied into that. I am still an artist, I am still a poet, and I'm a graduate student in engineering education, but I also have a small business where I do research and design related to social equity. And I've just started a magazine that allows me to talk about those things directly, to create conversations about those things, but also to make art and media about those things. So I think that is the best I can summarize now that I'm over time. But I'll just reiterate for me, the piece of my Blackness that I think I need to be the most visible is the social experience of it and the problems and oppression associated with that, and how that affects what engineering is for to me, why I even go to class, why I even have these conversations, and that is a piece that is often invisible, but that's the piece that's the most important to me and has been the most important to my success and my impact in my communities.
Can you say the name of your magazine for us or type it in the chat? Perfect.
Yeah, so
All
I
right.
just got links to art, poetry, my company, and the magazine. Go ahead, Debbie.
Cool. All right. Hi everyone. Most of folks who know me will call me Deli. But my name is Delian and I am from Detroit, as my friends are. And so I was trying to think about how to retell my story, and let's see where we go. I'm going to start with something that I took for granted, and I will honestly say I still take for granted, is that I grew up in a household where we really valued Black culture and our Blackness. And we also believe that Black engineering history started before we even got to this continent. And so we grew up learning, and I actually didn't know, I thought my mom was silly, but she would have like Ivan Van Sertima books. He was a scholar, Guyanese scholar at Rutgers, an Africana studies. And we would have his books in the house. And as she would see our interest in creating and playing around with things, she made sure that we knew that innovation and invention and all of this did not start here. In fact, she would teach us about the roles of Egyptians and Blacks, basically Blacks in building pyramids. And that's how we were exposed to engineering. She made sure we had that narrative from a young age. And so that also shapes and informs my view now. If I were to fast forward to where I am now, I strongly believe that because typically in the Black community, many people don't have that story. And because those stories aren't validated by our peers, institutions, education systems, that when Black students come to colleges of engineering and they haven't had structured experiences called engineering, they don't realize that we have a history of innovation that we can draw from and connect with. And so kind of that's, if I could summarize my story, that's that. But now let me jump in. So my mom taught us from young that Black people have been involved in this since before, for a long time. And my mom was in the automotive industry. My mom was a consultant. My dad is a supervisor. They're both still in the automotive industry now. They were married up until 4th grade, and then they divorced. But both of them had the same value, that education is currency. And that is how we move through. And if we don't value education in some way, some form, we will not be able to access the opportunities that are ahead of us. Our growth would be stunted. Some of the common phrases we grew up hearing is, alongside hearing about the Black contributions, was that in this society, we have to work twice as hard as white people to get just as far, in most cases, that we have to prove ourselves in order to really get what we need to get. I remember those conversations. I remember my dad being so excited. It was like 1993 or 1994 when he made a call over the internet to my uncle, early voice over IP, and he was so excited. He said, "I just called your uncle on the computer." So we grew up with like technology and being able to explore, but that also meant we had the resources to do it. And we were a part of the DAPSEP program, which you already heard before. My story with DAPSEP was a little bit more connected in that my mom was one of the first students to participate in DAPSEP in the 70s. And she got into it because she was in the streets and my grandma wanted to get her out the streets. So she found an engineering program that was just formed to expose her to other things. Kind of like what Chanel was alluding to. And so through that, my mom saw it as not only a fun thing to do, but a lifesaver. And she made sure all of us had some exposure to DAPSEP, but not expecting all of us to be engineers, just as an opportunity to expand our thinking and to get access to be on campuses in companies, things like that. And so from there, I was a student in DAPSEP. And then when I got to college, I was also a DAPSEP, like a teaching assistant. And through my time with DAPSEP, I've been able to do short internships with them, help work on some small projects for research, things like that. But during my time as a teaching assistant, it was around the same time I was selecting a major, and I didn't know what to do. I actually did not want to do, I had, I think manufacturing engineering was my major. And I didn't want to do electrical engineering because it was too hard. And so as a TA, I had access to Black engineers at Ford. And when they heard my rationale for why I did not want to do electrical engineering, they basically checked me. And they said, why are you avoiding something because it's hard? Is that your only excuse? And so that's one of those types of conversations that were emergent in my life that led me to pursue some of the hard things. And also I did it in the context of knowing I had a community of support, or with the idea that along the way I would hope to have a similar community. I think it's also interesting to note that I was a Bill and Melinda Gates scholar. And so that is the only way that we could have afforded college. There are 6 of us. I was number 2, and the first one of the 6 to complete college. And my mom was single at that point. So that's how we could afford college, was through that scholarship. And I chose U of M Dearborn because of its proximity. I wasn't mature enough to leave, but I thought it was important. At that point, when I went to visit the main campus, Michigan, Ann Arbor, I remember seeing the looks on some of the students' faces, and of Black students, and they did not make me feel comfortable. I recall something like a death stare. Like, they looked at me like, this is not where you want to be right now. I did not know what I was sensing, but it was enough for me to say, this is not the school for me right now. And so I went to Dearborn and started asking some tough questions. I started noticing that, yes, even though I came in with DAPSEP experience and confidence because of what I knew about how Blacks contributed to engineering and history, I still struggled a bit. And I also noticed that Blacks at my college were disproportionately not completing engineering. And so because of that, I would bring it up to administration, the old administration, and they did not seem to be concerned. And this kind of led to some started research questions that I really was starting to wonder about. And I didn't know what to do, though. So although I had research questions and I had done like directed studies, I did not know where to go. Industry, especially going to a regional campus in an urban area, industry looks like it's your only way. My mentor connected with me, and he saw some potential in me, and he connected me to his mentor. And his mentor is now a dean, Dean Gallimore at University of Michigan. But before he was a dean, I was working at Verizon Wireless in my last year. And he said, I want to talk to you. He spent 45 minutes talking to me, someone he'd never met, helping me navigate whether I should stay in industry and secure the bag and, right immediately, or whether I needed to pursue the intellectual questions that I had that industry would not allow me to pursue. And by the end of that conversation, I was committed to being a scholar, but didn't know what that looked like. So then that's when I did make it to University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I did also work with Shanna Daly. And she was really helped me with forming me as a scholar in my early years. And I also connected with MIPO, Minority Engineering Program Office at Michigan, CEDO, and SMESG, which was a graduate component. It's like a NSBE for graduate students. And they exposed me to the ugly highs and lows of doing this work, of being a graduate student, And I decided to go to Purdue, which was scary because I knew it was in the middle of nowhere. I got lots of warnings about my safety because of my race and some of the historical narratives, and not just narratives, this historical oppression and things, the challenges that Black people have faced in Indiana. And I was nervous, but I felt like that was the best place. That was where engineering education was. And so that's where I went. And because of my interest in K-12 and informal environments. And so that's where I met a great community of Black scholars. And even my mentor and advisor was Monica Cardella, and she started to introduce this balance of engineering, caring for people, families, like how all of this could possibly intersect. And I also was challenged by Dr. Monica Cox to consider the faculty route, which is something I still remember that conversation because if anyone knows her, she is blunt and straight to the point. And she asked me directly, why aren't you considering a faculty route? And that was enough to challenge me to think about what options could be available to me should I go that route. I think I want to stop there. There's lots more I could say, but I'm going to check my notes. I will say my plan was always to come back to Detroit. I just thought I would do it at the end of my career and not so soon. So I'm really excited to see why all of us are from here, going to Purdue to get this degree and then coming back. Maybe Donovan. Maybe.
Right. I just wanted to clear up a few things before we move to Donovan, because I know we've alluded to some things. So we haven't all known each other our whole lives. We got connected through a few different circles. I met James when I was applying for engineering education. James and I had like a 2 to 3 hour conversation where he gave me the highs and lows. Donovan and I did attend University of Michigan at the same time, but we were in different classes. And he called me, wanted to come to engineering education at Purdue, and I grilled him for a few hours as to why he was sure that's what he needed to do and what needed to happen in order to make sure that it was not a painful process. And then once I got to Purdue, I ended up in Daly's lab with Monica Cardella, but I was initially in the same lab with James. And then when Donovan came to Purdue, he came to Monica Cardella's lab. So Purdue was probably like the greatest meeting point, but this conversation happened at a NSBE convention once we had already kind of been established at Purdue, and we started thinking about our Detroit connection and kind of how these things evolve. So I don't know if that confused things or cleared it up, but Donovan, go ahead.
Thank you, Chanel. Start. So my story starts out at the very beginning. My parents divorced when I was 2 years old, and I had always vied for having a relationship with my father. My mother ended up being a single mother for 8 years, taking care of me for, it was just me and her, partners in crime, but I went to my dad's house every other weekend. My dad is an engineer. He has a certificate in engineering, but he does not have any formal degree in engineering. What he could do was he could take apart a car like nobody's business. He could fix computers. And so I remember as a 4 or 5-year-old looking up to him as someone who was an engineer. I didn't really know what engineering was at the time, but I thought he was an engineer. I had as a Detroit kid, and I consider Metro Detroit to be, I have many homes in that area. So I was born in Detroit, but I wasn't necessarily always in Detroit. I saw my dad as the engineer, and I wanted to be like him. I had a Hot Wheels car collection. I wanted to be a mechanical engineer as a 5-year-old because I thought mechanical engineers got to play with cars all day. So with that, I went to school and I did well in school for as long as I can remember. By the 6th grade, I had gotten recruited to go to University of Michigan, Ann Arbor to participate in their Life Academy, otherwise known as Living Intelligently Forever. And that was the first place that I saw like Black and brown people on campus, being on campus for the first time, really at the University of Michigan. And so I thought that would be the place that I belonged. I had kind of always wanted to be at the University of Michigan because it was a place in which I was brainwashed to want to go as a youngster. I also participated in DAPSEP, and I didn't necessarily enjoy my experience there because I think I just didn't take the right classes, and I didn't think it was a good fit for me. But by the time high school came for me, the Great Recession hit and the auto bailout happened. So a lot of people that I know were hit hard by that. A lot of my family members had lost their jobs, and including my parents. So we ended up losing our home at around the same time. This was before this, my stepfather and my mother were entrepreneurial. They were flipping houses in the Detroit area. And so I had seen that after the recession, after we lost our home, it was the time in which I started to take school more seriously. Like I knew I could get great grades and whatnot. But at that point in time, I realized that my parents wouldn't be able to afford my college education. So I had to stack the cards against the deck and participate in leadership activities, extracurricular activities, take on more employment, different things of that nature. So by the time I had gotten to my senior year of high school, I had actually won my first scholarship from the University of Michigan by participating in their summer college engineering exposure program. That senior year, I was working 3 different jobs at the same time. And that was also the same year where I won over $1 million in scholarships. And I wrote a book that same year called The Scholar's Key to help other teens motivate them to apply for scholarships. So getting all these scholarships was kind of confirmation for me that I did belong at the University of Michigan. I had received $100,000 in 3 different scholarships from the University of Michigan. And it was like, yes, we want you here. Yes, we know you should be here. And I joined MSTEM, which was a summer transition program for engineering students. I had my group of friends. My first year, I did well in school, and I had a lot of friends who were also in that program. But after I got into my higher level engineering courses, I really struggled with my sense of belonging. I actually forgotten to mention that since I didn't have the best relationship with my father, I also never really had a male role model or a male mentor in my life. So, and Trayvon Martin was my freshman year. His death was my freshman year. So it compounded every year. There was another police brutality, killing or death at the hand. And so I really struggled with feeling like I belong at the University of Michigan, being a predominantly white university. And in my engineering courses, I was often the only Black male in the course, especially as I got higher up. While I was in my junior year, I finally decided that I would go for an internship. I got an internship at General Motors in Flint, and this was in 2014. So I was a manufacturing engineering intern, and I was responsible for the facilities. And in this case, I was like doing busy work, looking at where water fountains were being piped to, making sure the fire suppression system was all good and covered the entire 3 million square foot facility. And I wasn't engaged. I had a great supervisor at the time, but I didn't feel like I was like, what work was this leading to, other than helping the business not be liable. By the time my next year came around, I also took a 5th year, but that summer I worked at a battery manufacturing plant for the General Motors. And it was there where I really struggled with feeling like engineering was really for me, because I had gotten into this battery assembly plant where I thought I'd be working with cool things like batteries for the Volt. And by the time, basically by the time I arrived, I had really only one interaction with my supervisor. The rest of the internship, I had to scramble to find projects on my own and prove my worth for the company, basically. It was also around the time that I started to really consider sustainability as a big key issue. And when I left Flint, the Flint water crisis had went public. So I really started to consider my role in how I really played a role in making sure the General Motors was not liable, because I was looking at the water systems and whatnot. So when I finally got to my super senior year of college, I struggled with feeling like I belonged in engineering. And really, I was just trying to survive, like most of the people in NSBE, which was a huge support for me. Oh, that is my time.
Finish up though.
Sorry about that. But just to finish up, I ended up working for the Summer Engineering Academy after I graduated, because that was one thing I had always wanted to do. I found fulfillment in working with youth and exposing them to engineering. And that led me to looking at presentations from Dr. Carl Reed, the director of NSBE, and Dr. Norman Fortenberry, the director of ASEE, and seeing Black men in high positions in engineering education really promoted the idea of me going to engineering education at Purdue. So I pursued engineering education to look at how we can apply entrepreneurship and engineering to help underrepresented or minoritized youth get exposure to engineering and entrepreneurship so that they can build generational wealth. And I love my experience at Purdue, but I'm definitely learning how to navigate Purdue still, just like at University of Michigan.
So we do have a few last minute notes we want to share. I know we are getting close to time. James, was this me or you? I'm sorry.
Is there anything else to share?
Yeah. In terms of our last few slides, so I do think we can, there are a few questions that came into the chat.
I thought you meant about my story, my bad.
No, not
yeah,
that,
so,
not yet.
I could frame this, I'm tripping. So what our aim was really around, like, as engineering education researchers and scholars and such thing, like, we don't want you all just to take this information as, like, personally, this is interesting to hear these stories that was so deep, but it was something I didn't know. But think about and reflect on, how does this inform your work? How do you do research in particular, as well as how you teach and how you, as an engineering education community member. And so some of those things that we wanted to highlight was a few steps, ways to guide. So one of those, identifying theoretical frameworks developed by scholars of color, right? So the essential aspect of what we're modeling today is using our insider perspective as a group participant in a group that's marginalized, right? So you can study that group, you can examine and question that group, but only they can best articulate the disconnects between the norms of whiteness within engineering and how their existence operates outside of that. And so when people develop frameworks, it's a reflection of that. I'm also selecting critical methodologies, and I advocating for the word critical because it signals addressing issues of power, privilege, identity, and how, underprivileged or being underserved, under-resourced, and ostracized according to identity markers. And then engaging in intentional citation practices. So in just looking for those who you know, look for those that you don't know, right? Look for those who at a different perspective and uplift their work, not just for the sake of even just citing them, saying like, oh, I got a few Black women on my reference list, but how are they framing things, and how can you highlight their lens within your actual work, citing Black women and citing Black people, and then research questions in terms of what are you seeking to ask and study. Again, using trying to use other folks as a resource to see what am I missing, how I ask this question, and what I'm looking for, how might I do this a different way to be more helpful to the community in terms of diversity, inclusion, and so on, and equity.
I wanted to contribute here that what we've shared today is really, for some of you, it might be a starting point. For other people, it might just be another point in your journey and learning about these things and doing something about them. But this should be a part of a continued practice, a part of an ecosystem of both your own learning, but also your own action. So we talked about it in terms of your research and your work, because we are at ASEE. Many of us have that shared identity of doing work within the research field. But I just wanted to stress that this goes beyond your research. This also relates to your purchasing practices, your voting practices, all the things that you use your sphere of influence for can be informed by these things, because there's not a difference between the social and technical. They are together. A few of us are actually working on a paper that says that explicitly in a few different ways, but there are papers that already kind of do that. Okay. I think that is the end of our formal presentation. We did want to kind of honor the time and give people time to put questions in the chat. But if you need to go, I think most of us are available for a conversation afterwards. So you can hit us up if there are ideas. We would like you, though, to start at home first. So start kind of interrogating the questions that you have in your own head first, then try it with your community, try it with your kind of trusted circles. And then, all else fails and you still need to talk to us, we are here for it. But we just don't want to present ourselves as experts or as somebody who can help you process some of these things, because it is a little heavy to hear 4 different perspectives that for a lot of our viewers are so distant from our own social experience. So we do want to honor the fact that we want to give people space to process, which is now why we didn't make this a very super interactive conversation, right? Because we're practicing listening.
If I can jump in too, I noticed that Diane asked for resources, and I also noticed we have an advisor. So if you're a high school advisor, you're a pre-college educator or teacher, you need a starting list of innovators, Black innovators and inventors and engineers, email me. I do have some illustrations that you can use to post in your classroom and things like that. I didn't create them, but I can definitely share them. So if that's what you need to help you expose more youth to this, please email me.
And I did get a question about the magazine, and there's a part of it that's kind of relevant to this conversation. So I'm going to share my screen in a second to provide a little bit more concrete resource, but also the notebook that we created just to help you.
Hey, Chanel,
out some questions too.
Chime in really quick and then give it right back to y'all.
Yeah.
All right. So I forgot to launch the poll. So I am about to launch a poll because we do like to collect data on the people who are coming. And so can you just really quickly fill out your primary role? And then I also would like to thank our facilitators for coming. All 4 of them mean something to me in a different way since I, came to Purdue. Inside of Purdue or outside of Purdue, like James connected me to Heads Up, a program in Lafayette, Indiana, and I love those kids dearly, even though I'm not working with them right now. But I just really wanted to thank you all for coming and sharing your stories. I really value you as just people and as scholars. And just as a reminder, we have 2 more sessions for our summer series. So next week, we'll be talking about culturally responsive teaching in times of COVID-19. And then the following week, we'll be talking about diversity papers. So trying to give some insight as to how to, write a paper that is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I believe the dates for the abstract submissions just launched recently. So please join us and register. And you have it, Chanel.
Fellow panelists, did y'all have anything else? Because y'all know I can talk. So before I get into
Yeah, I did. One thing I was thinking about as you all were speaking was, oh, well, actually, it wasn't while you were speaking. I think, Chanel, you put it in the, let me select my role, chat that all three of you all were Bill Gates scholars. And the first time we did it, I mentioned it, but I didn't talk about it this time. Like, I graduated high school with a 2.69 GPA. And so, you know, really, when we talk about counter storytelling, it's part of that is just sharing our stories. Part of that is providing a comprehensive perspective, but also part of that is challenging the ways that preparedness for engineering is positioned and talked about, right? So Deli talked about being worried because it was seemed hard, and I think that needs to be unpacked because everything is hard in some way, but engineering likes to position itself as harder or more difficult than these other, or you have to be smarter, and it's just like, you know, we need to unpack what is intelligence and how does it look, and as well as addressing the social and technical aspects of engineering, right? And thirdly, before I pass it on, we started this new division around equity and culture and social justice and education. And it's like, I don't think people look at, like I specifically highlighted my elementary and middle school public school education because that was my grounding, that was my base that gave me and put me in the space to be where I am now. But Detroit public schools historically has been disinvested and like tremendously inequitable. And so how does that contribute to who is and who is not within engineering, school systems, and what's the role of higher education within that? And I think one of the ways is unpacking and shifting how we see intelligence, how we see the field, and who's qualified to be in the field. And I'll stop there.
I think I want to piggyback on that. Thanks, James. Because what I didn't talk about was I was in Catholic schools. So we did have a more resource. Obviously, we're paying tuition. Catholic schools were really great in Detroit up until probably 2000s. And so that did play a role in the resources that I had access to. The thing I forgot to mention was the role of my mom, too. She was an engineer, didn't earn a degree. I think she was 1 year short. Up through college, she was able to help me with some of my homework. She could probably still do it better than I can. But I think the role of my mentors telling me when they challenged me they asked me, why are you saying it's hard? Is that your only excuse? They were all Black. And so for me to hear Black people who have the degree in engineering telling me, I know you think it's hard, but that can't be your only excuse. That meant something, that they look like me. They've had a similar experience and they could kind of like shed the light on the path to say you can get through it.
There are a couple things I didn't mention as well, but I did want to honor that. I'm trying to slow down. Sorry, I know I talk fast. I did want to honor that there was a question that came up in the chat. So if the panelists can read that, we can answer that after I say what I was about to say. I think it was about mentoring. The question was posed by Scott. The thing I wanted to say before we got to that question was another part of my story that I didn't highlight was the fact that my grandfather, my mother's father, he worked for the telecom industry right as the internet became a thing. So though a lot of the programming in my school didn't have access to a lot of things, I had a Windows 95 computer in like 97, 98. And I couldn't do much. You know, we had to wait for the little CDs to come in the mail to get online. I didn't even know what that was about. But I played a lot of games, and I played with Microsoft Office a lot, actually. I wrote stories. I played with PowerPoint. I used to make PowerPoints about SpongeBob, about rappers I like, about like for my parents' birthday. But what that meant is once I got in school and those things were being taught to me, I had already interacted with those things in a lot of ways. So I wasn't uncomfortable, and I wasn't afraid of the computer. I wasn't, it was just kind of a part of my generation. And granted, that was true for my peers as well, because we all kind of, Facebook became a thing my freshman year. Facebook became a thing that you could do and not be in college my freshman year of high school, right? So we had technology, we were text messaging, but not all of us were making PowerPoints, and not all of us were playing around in Excel and figuring those things out. So then when it came time for me to go to college, my preparedness never really got articulated. It was just the fact that I had done all these things and had this portfolio of work. And I really, you know, when James was talking about what that preparedness looks like, I don't think I got a lot of credit for that in the process of applying for schools. You know, it made my experience a little bit easier, and it made me easier to mentor and easier to get through things, but nobody ever identified the fact that like this specific experience was straight up technology just because she wanted to, changes her experience with any of these technologies that suggested to her, you know, once I got into undergrads. Because when I got in undergrad, not only am I using PowerPoint and, you know, all the different engineering softwares, but I'm in groups with people who don't look like me, who have, in many cases, articulated that they had no interest in working with me, right? So that level of complication is a lot different if I'm also confused about the technology. You know, and because I didn't have that, that became a different thing. So I think as we think about preparedness, it is not just, you know, articulated skills or articulated intellect. For a lot of us, it is what our past experiences have been with these things. And for a lot of students, they interact with these engineering technologies in a place of trauma for the first time. So they aren't really able to engage with it the same way once they get to professional space. So if my first interaction with PowerPoint was in those engineering groups where people are questioning my intelligence and I don't know this technology, that stays with me, you know? So, and that's another piece of it, that the trauma of it is hard to understand, but it does affect the impact of it. So that's the piece that I wanted to surface.
I want to hop in real quick, so I want to answer a question. I got to run, even though I get so excited in these moments. Now, like my perspective, there's a lot to say about the question of different programming and what's too much. My perspective in relation to this conversation, I think that a lot of these programs are to make up for the inequities of school and primary educational experiences. A lot of urban communities, families are trying to put their kids in anything because it's like, I need you to, I don't know how it's going to help you, but it's supposed to help and I want you to get there. And a lot of times you see is the middle class and the families who are already doing the right thing are kind of overdoing it because they just like, I just need whatever I can to get you in this space. And so the programs that are more sensitive and equitable are designed solely for those on a lower income level. So even if you could benefit in middle income or whatever, it's designed for those who like the least of us. And then, but you have to have money to get access to the other programs. So this middle family gets left out. So they're just reaching wherever they can. But I also just think that there's so many inequities that, you know, people in urban spaces and schools, and I'm not saying you should rely totally on schools, but I think a critical question we need to ask is, what skills are these programs actually providing for our kids that are transferable? Because a lot of folks are going to programs with promises and you expose you to this and we'll do that. And they come out the other side without any skills that actually translate to their higher ed experience or without any actual engineering competency and skill development. So, you know, building bridges is like one of those examples. A lot of programs you build bridges and call it engineering. It's a lot of, and, you know, a lot of more so arts and crafts. But what type of knowledge can be tied to the student gaining? Or, you know, so me being in the pre-college space, that's what I try to focus on is what, not to say that students have to become engineers, but if we look at what is required to be successful in those programs or in the industry, how can we build programs around that doesn't disenfranchise the students or exclude their cultural? Like some stuff needs to be challenged because it's too constricted, but other ways it needs to be amplified and made stronger. So there's a through line that this skill is transferable to this program as opposed to you did all these programs, but once you get in class, you're like, I'm an engineer. You don't know what any of this stuff. You haven't any exposure. So thank you all again for coming. I got to head out to the meeting.
Thank you, James. James organized all of this, so we do very much appreciate your work. I think pushing that idea a little further, thinking about what skills are transferable. I think we also need to make explicit what our end is, because if we think about transferable in terms of the classroom, that's one set of skills. If we think of transferable in terms of industry, that's a whole nother set of skills that has a whole different kind of metric. But if we think about the end as in like, what skills do you need in order to be a useful, helpful member of your local and national community, that's a whole different thing. You know, and I think a lot of our programs, because we are so, we're caught in the middle of a lot of inequities. We're forced to scope our problem solving to the immediate. How do I get the student from 8th grade to 9th grade to 10th grade, right? And I'm not faulting that at all. But I am saying for those of us who have more time and more resources and more space to process, I think we need to think about what is it that an eighth grader is concerned about in the world. Who do they want to be when they grow up, and what kind of impact do they want to have? And then what skills do I need to give them in order to get there? That is a more complicated conversation because that's more about personal and professional development. But I think within STEM, there is a call for thinking about that upfront, thinking about that not after the person has a degree or not once they get to senior year and you want them to do a capstone project with other people, but no, how does this person show up and what skills do they need to show up in a way that is not disenfranchising for themselves, but also that doesn't create more social distance and propagate the space between engineers and the rest of society. And that's where a lot of my work sits, in trying to look at how do people experience engineers and how do people do engineering without calling it that, and what space can we bring in the middle of that so that we are not just trying to get students from point A to point B that is so far from their community and so far from what it is they actually care about, and then make it their job to figure out how to reverse that and make it useful for their community. No, we can start the conversation in the community. What engineering skills, what interpersonal skills, what entrepreneurial skills, what cultural skills have you been using, what skills work, and then how does that translate to what could be done in this pipeline of education? A lot more complicated, but that is kind of where my work has been focusing as of late.
I'll just say, add to answer that question, how do we help students figure out if they're overcommitted, what's beneficial? Just to go back to kind of to connect what Chanel and James are saying, at some point, you just need a program to keep your child invested, exposure into something new, even protect them from external things going on outside the house, something to fill their time, or they have interest. So that's kind of the family and child working together to determine what programs are available, what do they know about, and how can they get their kid in it. Now, as students get older, I think it's helpful for them to understand why this is important. And I think even at that point, parents should be asking, what skills are my children getting? If they've been in only engineering exposure programs and there aren't specific skills that you're saying they can apply, you might want to, that's just something to be thinking about. And that's something we think about as researchers, is that explicit engineering skills, and how do we name them and validate them if they already exist, and how do we incorporate them if they're not there? So beyond bridge building. But for college students, I think the question is, why am I in this program? What is it providing me? And kind of who do I want to become? And that kind of goes to, like for me, SMESG, they weren't giving me technical experience, but they are giving me access to Black graduate students who were in it and who I could talk to and provide community and advice. And I needed that program, so I had to stay in that program. But when I needed technical skills, I was in engineering case study competitions and things like that. And so it's helping students figure out what are their needs, because based off of where they want to be or where they think they want to be, and then helping them, if you see a student's overwhelmed, helping them think about, what are my needs, what am I getting from these organizations, and how do I, navigate that. So that's answers. I hope that answers the initial question a little bit more.
Donovan, I don't know if you had anything to add or if there are any further questions. I'll just say, as you are on this journey of learning about these things, be cognizant and intentional about how you find information. I guess I'm just trying to say, when people are going through trauma, is often not the best time to ask them about that trauma. So I would suggest reaching out to colleagues and peers who are kind of on your level first, before you reach out to students who might be going through these kind of things or having these kind of concerns, just because there's a certain amount of trauma that you recreate as you try to talk about the trauma. And just be aware of that social distance, that you might be very well intending and very much wanting to do something about the problem, but because of your positionality, you might not be the person that people necessarily want to talk to and can talk to comprehensively. So then your job becomes trying to find ways that you can support spaces for people to get out what they need to get out, right? And not necessarily centering yourself in the problem solving. But you can still center your resources, right? You can center the space and opportunity for people to use whatever you have at your exposure to address what needs to be addressed. The link I dropped that was for The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is a book that talks about letting people define their own liberation, and not getting caught in your conception of what that liberation needs to look like or what that change should be, but literally listening to people who need the change and letting them define and describe what every step of that looks like. That process is messy though, because For most of us, especially if we have any type of pull within engineering, we have a good amount of privilege and a good amount of stuff to lose, you know, even if it's just the emotional, you know, conception of yourself as expert, that has to be massaged down if you want to interact with people on this level, right? And that process of losing stuff, that process of reconceptualizing your power and your influence, that is an emotional process. This is not just an intellectual conversation. So I do just caution that as you are having these conversations, you make space to consider that, you make space to honor. Sometimes, you know, you can't quite center yourself in the conversation and it still happen the way it needs to happen. I did want to share, just want to share my screen quickly. This is a part of my magazine where we talk about the process of relieving social oppression, however you might describe it. But given the context of what we're in right now, what happens is we see this violence happening to oppressed groups, and we just want down here the goal, we want it to be over, right? We want some experience shift to happen. There are a lot of steps and a lot of pieces that can look like. So we're seeing a lot of public demonstrations, we're seeing some economic demonstrations, but I think in order to get to the policy shift space, we have to start expressing and redesigning internally and externally how we're doing this work. So the recommendations we made in this presentation were, you know, thinking about what is your sphere of influence and how can you better negotiate that with what we've been talking about. But this is a process, and you know, if you want to talk more about that, I'm open to it. The magazine does kind of talk through steps of that, so how you can oops, went the wrong way. But how you can kind of think about your own personal experience of these shifts, right, and what you need to be thinking about on each of those steps. So I'm just saying this is not an easy thing, and there are resources to walk this way.
All right. Thank you, Bree and Megan, for hosting this conversation and letting us facilitate today.